समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Spain under Pedro Sánchez has become a curious case of Donald Trump's favorite punching bag in Europe today. So what is happening with Spain and who is Pedro Sánchez, and Donald Trump को Sanchez पे इतना गुस्सा क्यों आ रहा है? You may have seen images of effigies of Benjamin Netanyahu being burnt in Spanish towns, and I'm sure you have heard Donald Trump's sharp and personal anger directed at Spain and its Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez. Now, Spain has cancelled military deals with Israel, imposed what is effectively a sweeping arms embargo on Tel Aviv, and has taken positions that have triggered strong reactions from both Israel and the United States, and even some European partners. Now, Netanyahu understandably has issued a strong rebuttal. Trump has gone even further, saying that Spain should be thrown out of NATO and that economic ties should be choked. That raises an obvious question. Why is Trump so mad at the small European country that is both a member of NATO and the EU and actually has deep military relations with the United States? Now, does this mean Spain is now an outlier within NATO and the European Union, pretty much like what Viktor Orban in Hungary was? Or does it simply mean we need to look more carefully at Spain's historical and political context? As is often the case, the truth lies somewhere in between. So for today's explainer, I'll unpack what explains the very curious case of Spain under Pedro Sánchez, a leader who has in many ways defied expectations by standing up to the United States and Donald Trump, while diverging from several of his European allies, and yet may not be able to win the next Spanish elections. But before I start, I have to make an appeal. If you haven't already become a member to The Print, please consider taking subscription, because quality journalism, quality investigative stories, and quality explainers, all of that requires your support. Let's start. The part one is what is causing the friction. Now, since October 7, 2023, Spain has emerged as one of the most vocal critics of Israel's military actions, particularly in Gaza and the broader Levant. But what exactly is driving his stance? Is Spain fundamentally pro-Palestinian, or is it taking a broader anti-war, anti-interventionist position? And then there are other decisions. Why did Spain refuse to increase NATO defense spending to 5% of GDP at the 2025 NATO summit, insisting it would remain at 2% only? Does Spain oppose European militarization? Or, like Hungary under Viktor Orban, is it also reluctant to support Ukraine against Russia? Now, before I give you answers to these, the tensions have further escalated in 2026. For instance, on 2nd of March 2026, Spain declared it would bar the United States from using its military bases at Rota and Moron for offensive operations against Iran. On 30th March, Spain closed its airspace to the United States aircrafts involved in any strikes on Iran. Now, these moves directly challenged long-standing defense arrangements with Washington. So, is this a structural geopolitical shift or just a personal clash between Trump and Sanchez? And beyond Europe, why is Spain deepening ties with Latin America and the global South? Is this part of a broader strategy, or is it simply to win elections back home? And that brings me to part two. Why does Spain matter, and why are we discussing it? You know, the thing is, Spain is not a peripheral player. It is a major NATO member, a key European Union economy, one of the better performing economies in Europe today, an emerging defense partner for countries like India. For instance, remember the C-295 transport aircraft deal that we have struck with Spain. It is also a country with deep historical and cultural ties to Latin America and the global South. So when Spain takes a position that diverges from its allies, it needs to be understood better, especially if you are sitting in New Delhi. So, is Sanchez truly an outlier, or is he continuing a longer Spanish tradition? Now, to answer that, we need a bit of history, and for that, let's begin closer to the opening of the millennium. And that brings me to part 3, which is the 2004 Madrid attacks and the Iraq War. On March 11, 2004, 10 bombs exploded across commuter trains in Madrid, across a number of stations. 193 people were killed, around 2,000 were injured, and it remains the deadliest terror attack in Spanish history. Now, what made it even more consequential was the timing. It occurred just 3 days before a general election. The sitting Prime Minister, José María Aznar, initially blamed the Basque separatist group or the ETA. However, investigations quickly revealed links to Al-Qaeda. The attackers were radicalized in response to the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 that had resulted in Saddam Hussein's death, a war that Spain had supported under Aznar and had also sent troops to. Now, this decision was taken by Aznar despite being deeply unpopular at home. Around 90% of Spaniards opposed the Iraq War. Massive protest had erupted, with nearly 3 million people participating in mass protest. Even if you see the pictures today, they are quite something. Now, the political consequences were immediate. Aznar lost the elections. The incoming Prime Minister, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, withdrew Spanish troops from Iraq within a week itself. Now, this episode left a lasting imprint on Spanish society. It reinforced a deep skepticism toward foreign military interventions, especially those led by the United States. But at this juncture, I have to clarify that you please remember that Spain has deep ties with the US, in fact, deep military ties with the US. And that brings me to part 4, that there is a longer history of Spain that we need to understand, which brought it from isolation to reintegration. So Spain's worldview wasn't really shaped in 2004 or the memory of the 2004 alone. To understand its instincts, we need to go further back. And here, let's talk of Franco and post-war isolation. After the Second World War, Spain was diplomatically isolated due to General Francisco Franco's alignment with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In 1946, the UN recommended member states withdraw ambassadors from Madrid. Spain was not a democracy then and was excluded from major international institutions. Franco, for the record, had ruled since 1939 after winning the Spanish Civil War that started in 1936 and remained in power until his death in 1975. Therefore, Spain did not join either the NATO until 1982 or the European Union until 1986. But to end its isolation, Spain under Franco reached out to the United States directly, and that led us to the 1953 Madrid Pact. Like I said, to break that isolation from Europeans and from the world over, Franco made a strategic move in 1953. He signed a defense pact with the United States. And under this, Spain agreed to host US military bases at Zaragoza, Morón, de la Frontera, Rota, and Torreón. In return, the US provided economic aid, military equipment, and diplomatic rehabilitation. Now, these bases still exist today. In fact, Rota in particular remains one of NATO's most important naval installations, and notably, it's the same base that Spain restricted or barred US access to in 2026, which is this year, in the ongoing Iran war. But there was a second method that Franco pursued as well, and that was a pragmatic outreach to the Arab world. You know, Spain's historical connection to the Arab and Muslim world dates back centuries. From about 711 to 1492, much of the Iberian Peninsula, you can see it on the map, which is today Spain and Portugal, was under Muslim rule. Now, this legacy still influences, for instance, Spanish architecture, language, and culture. However, going back, just 40 years after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Iberian Peninsula underwent a monumental transformation, marking the end of 800 years or 8 centuries of Muslim rules, with the fall of Granada to the Catholic monarchs. Now, remember this history and let's come back to Franco. So Spain recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, one of the first Western countries to do so, because that was the easiest shortcut to get acceptance within the Arab world then. and built economic and diplomatic ties with Arab nations. Now, this dual strategy, alignment with the US on the one hand and engagement with the Arab world on the other, helped Spain reintegrate into global politics and international trade, and it basically kept the Franco regime afloat. Now we have to come to part 5 and also understand the memory of the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath in shaping Spain's anti-war stance. Another critical factor shaping Spain's worldview is the memory of its own civil war from 1936 to 1939. Around 500,000 people died in it. Franco's forces were backed by Nazi Germany and air power from fascist Italy. The democratically elected government was defeated and hell broke loose for 3 years. After Franco's death in 1975, Spain transitioned to being a democracy, and this transition was based on the Pacto del Olvido, or the Pact of Forgetting, under which archives were sealed and no widespread prosecutions were conducted. The idea was to move on. And yet, the memory never fully disappeared. Mass graves are still being discovered by families that continue to search for their lost relatives. Now, this history has contributed to a national identity that is deeply cautious about war and interventionist internal conflict. By the way, these experiences also made Spain a pioneer in international law. So one of the best law universities in Europe are in Spain. For instance, in 1998, a Spanish judge indicted Chile's former dictator Augusto Pinochet. Further, Spanish courts later played a role in prosecuting crimes against humanity globally. Now let's come to part 6 and come to the Sanchez era and see what has been the continuity and change. So Pedro Sánchez came to power in 2018. Under his leadership, Spain deepened ties with Latin America. It continued, of course, being members to the EU and NATO, but continued developing ties with Latin America. It positioned itself as a bridge to the global south and moved somewhat beyond traditional Western alliance frameworks. Now, with regards to Israel and Palestine, Spain's stance on Israel became especially visible after 2023, and I told you about it in the opening sections of today's explainer. In 2024, Spain joined Ireland and Norway in recognizing Palestinian state. It also became maybe the first European nation to use the term genocide to describe Israel's actions in Gaza. It called on to the EU to review its trade policy with Israel. Then it also took further steps that included joining South Africa's genocide case at the International Court of Justice in June 2024. It also opened a national court probe into Israeli actions that it considered war crimes. And this context sets the argument on defense and NATO, because it was then at the NATO summit in June 2025 when Spain refused to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP under Donald Trump's pressure. Sanchez's government argued this was to prioritize development and social spending. And again, it is the same context that also explains Spain's arms embargo against Israel. In September 2025, Spain's parliament passed a full arms embargo against Israel. Naturally, the United States responded sharply, summoning Spain's ambassador. But Spain did not reverse its position, and this needs to be underscored. Finally, to sum up Sanchez's position on the 2026 Iran crisis and US tensions, these tensions have peaked during the 2026 Iran conflict, and Trump has reacted with characteristic intensity, bluster, escalating rhetoric against Spain. And to some extent, one has to understand that Spain can afford to escalate the tension with Donald Trump, not because of Spain being a heavyweight, because it is protected by its position within the European Union. The US actually cannot impose unilateral economic sanctions or end military cooperation with the United States, because remember that military cooperation continues despite all these tensions, because US bases in Spain gives the United States a very, very important stronghold in the South Atlantic and Mediterranean. And that brings me to the last part. What about the domestic politics? What are the strengths or risks for Sanchez there? Sanchez's stance has had mixed but largely positive domestic effects, at least until 2025. Many Spaniards view his defiance of Trump as a matter of national dignity, and he has successfully framed it as standing up to external pressure and to Trump the bully. Now, economically, Spain is doing well, and that speaks well for the Sanchez government. For the record, growth is projected at around 2.7%. Spain has been one of the fastest growing economies in the Eurozone. Unemployment has been at its lowest since the financial crisis. It has also received credit rating upgrades from major agencies. But political challenges remain. For example, next elections are due in August 2027, and polls suggest that his Socialist Party, which is already in a fragile coalition, may struggle to secure a majority. The Conservative Popular Party and the far-right Vox are gaining ground. So, Spain's behavior may look unusual today, but is deeply rooted in its own history and historical experience. Its foreign policy reflects a mix of a long-standing anti-war sentiment, skepticism of external military interventions, etc., historical ties to both the US and the Arab world, and a desire to act as a bridge to the global south. All of this is coming from that context. So Pedro Sanchez is not really inventing a new doctrine. He's amplifying existing tendencies under new geopolitical conditions with pragmatism and opportunism. Now, whether Sanchez's approach becomes a lasting shift or a temporary phase will depend heavily on the outcome of the 2027 elections, and I do see that anti-incumbency is going to act against Sanchez. But needless to say, I'll be back to discuss that and more, so you stay tuned.